I'm Nicholas McGee, and I'll be talking about the history and political goals of education. So, the beginnings of education. We're going to start with colonial schooling. And during the colonial age of America, some of the major contributors to education were Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the bill for the more general diffusion of knowledge, and then George Washington, once he was elected president, proposed a national university. And then Johann Fichte advocates for teaching patriotism, because patriotism was a big thing in colonial America, because we had just, came off of the Revolutionary War, and patriotism was a big subject. Being an American was a good thing, and a lot of people were pro-war, during those times, because we were fighting the British. So in this age, the political agenda of education was to breed patriots who would contribute to American society. Alright, so after colonial America, we have Horace Mann. He's the next guy who contributed a lot to education. So what Horace Mann did is, once he was elected to the Massachusetts, pretty much it was a board of education back then. He was elected to the he became the Secretary of Education for Massachusetts. He traveled to Europe, and while he was in Europe, mainly Prussia, he looked at a lot of their school systems. And he came back to America and realized that we were behind. And he really liked what he saw in Europe, and so he decided to model a bunch of schools, pretty much make them the same. And this is where we get the name the Common School. Okay, and he sought to make the public educated. And this is around the time that people started calling the 3 R's a big thing. There's the reading, writing, and arithmetic. And then history, geography, and ethics. Ethics was a big deal with the Common School. The Common School sought to be a type of moral teaching type of school, as well as general education. They wanted to teach people how to act. Teachers were big disciplinarians of that time. And Horace Mann also wanted these schools to be non-sectarian, which he didn't want them to be affiliated with any type of religion. However, in a lot of their readings, they did use the King James Bible, which some people did object to at the time. However, this was just the most common type of literature at the time, so that was what they used. And he wanted to equalize everybody in this type of education by providing a common education for all children, which is once again where we get Common School from. And around this time was also a big career opportunity for women, because they started training women as teachers, because men were doing other manly jobs at the time, so women got new career opportunities. So around this time, a political goal of education was to morally train the children, because that's where the children spent most of their time. Rather than working in the fields all day with their parents, they would go to school around this time. So, after the early 1800s, we have the Civil War and the Industrial Age. Now, around this time, education started to suffer. Why? Okay, well, big deal is we have the Civil War. Kids aren't going to be going to school when there's battles being fought in their backyard. Okay, and the ones that did get to go to school were the ones that came from wealthy families. After the Civil War, okay, we're still in the Industrial Revolution, and, kids are a source of cheap labor. So kids are going to be leaving the schools in favor of working. And even education around this time starts being geared to produce laborers to work in the factories. And after the Civil War, of course, slavery had been abolished. And, then we have the first major education lawsuit, okay, with the Plessy versus Ferguson. It'll set the precedent for segregation in education for a long time. That maintained that separate but equal was okay, as long as the black schools were equal in quality to the white schools. It was okay for them to be separate. This wasn't usually the case, but people claimed that it was the case. So it ended up, being held like this for a long time. Because people claimed that it was equal, even though it wasn't. Okay, also, around this time, people start using school as a form of social control. So, people worked around this time, a lot of times 7 days a week. And so school kind of replaced family, church, that type of thing, because this is where kids would be most of the time. And that was almost kind of where they were raised. They were raised by a teacher. A teacher was like a child care manager as well as an educator. Alright, so after the industrial age of America, then we're getting into the early 1900s, and in early 1900s, the Home Economics Association, the Vocational Guidance Bureau, Committee of Public Information, and the National Education Association are founded. And these are all associations that helped reform education and help form the curricula that was that's still being used today. Okay, like home economics was developed around this time, and vocational guidance, the vocational path in schools, was developed around this time to help people get trades so they could have jobs later. Okay, so then we have World War I. During World War I, we have a lot of pro-war propaganda. Okay, everybody's, oh, America, even though we weren't in the war that long, we still had a lot of patriotism during this time. Okay, we're united. It's been a while since the Civil War, and everybody's like, America. Okay, so nationalism and patriotism were big things on the political agenda as far as education was concerned. Okay, and also around this time, history textbooks were redesigned because who was America's big ally in World War I? It was Great Britain. So they redesigned the history books to make Britain appear less like the bad guys during the American Revolution. Alright, also, another noteworthy mention here is the Boy and Girl Scouts. They were founded at this time, and they partnered with the schools to help raise money, and they were a major extracurricular activity for boys and girls in school at this time. And after World War I, we have women's suffrage, which granted women the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. And with the 19th Amendment, women saw more rights in education. Women were created equal to men, and so they were given better rights in education. Alright, after World War I, in 1929, we had the stock market crash. So with this came the Great Depression. And not only did jobs suffer during the Great Depression and the economy suffer, but education suffered as well. So during this time, education took a sharp fall, especially in the South. The South was underdeveloped, and it's still recovering from the Civil War because there's a lot of stuff that had to be done. So many families couldn't afford to send their children to school, and the only children that got good educations around this time were either children that happened to live in a district that still had money to provide public schooling, or they happened to come from a wealthy family. And even kids that were able to go to public schools, a lot of time their learning suffered because they were malnourished and they were exposed. So also another interesting factor on this time is that the Dick and Jane reading primers were published. And everybody knows, See Jane Run, Run Dick Run, all that stuff. Okay, so these came out around that time. Alright, and what got us out of the Great Depression was World War II. And World War II we saw a rise in school attendance, okay, because we had an economic boom. People could afford to send their kids back to school, even, if tuition was a little higher than they would have liked, they had plenty of work. Why? Because we were making lots of things, airplanes, tanks, ammunition, ships, for the war effort. So people had jobs, and so they had money, and their kids were going to school. All right? So another big thing during this time, nationalism and patriotism. We have pro-war propaganda. All right? Nationalism and patriotism are huge things in school at this time. Everybody is proud to be American, and they're doing their part to help the war effort. So this was a big thing. Prayer was actually advocated in schools at this time. They had time set aside where they would pray for the Allied troops overseas. So during this time, geography and the sciences saw an increase in integration into the curriculum because, why? We were developing new weapons. We wanted our kids to be smart to help with the war. We didn't know how long it was going to last. Okay, and geography. We wanted our children to know where our troops were overseas. Okay, so there was an increase in these two subjects taught in schools. All right, right around the end of World War II, we have the Life Adjustment Education Program. And the deal with this is that people noticed that there weren't as many people going to college around this time, but there weren't people that were being trained for skilled trades at this time either. So what this did was this provided types of classes for kids to be educated just to make a living or be successful in life. They included things like home economics, little accounting classes, helping them, work out their finances, and basically just kind of a little crash course in life. Okay? And right after World War II, we saw a big expansion in high schools. High schools spread out across America, and they were extremely common because people were coming home from the war, okay, and they had time to spend with their kids, they had money to spend on their kids, and they wanted their kids to get a good education. And, some of the people that fought in World War II, they only had, 8th grade education, 6th grade education, maybe less, and they wanted their kids to have more. So secondary education was a big deal around this time. All right, 1950s through the 1980s. In the 1950s, okay, right after World War II, okay, we have patriotism and the sciences, all right? Patriotism, it's still a huge thing. Everybody's proud to be American. You want to do your part to help America. We're in the Cold War, okay, with the Soviet Union. And we want our kids to outperform the Soviet kids, okay? And this is where the National Defense Education Act came in, okay? We actually enlisted our schools against the Soviet schools. It was kind of a competition, all right? And we wanted our students to win. We wanted to win the race. The Sputnik satellite is one big thing that sparked all of this. We were like, hey, Russia's got stuff in space. We need to catch up. All right, another thing around this time was that there was a lot of bomb drills in schools. That's where you get the duck and cover saying, everybody was afraid of atomic bombs, and that was a big fear back then, and that influenced education. But we had the nationalism and patriotism, we're America, and, we're going to win the war. We're going to do our part to develop technology and things so this doesn't happen to us. Okay, during this time, we also had an increased emphasis on rural schooling. Okay, people realized that people in rural parts of America, especially in the South, were suffering in education, and they made attempts at reform. Okay, you also have an increase in college graduation because people were graduating from high schools. Remember, high schools, they spread across America right at the end of World War II. So right after the 50s and into the 60s were, of course, a big time for the Civil Rights Movement. And a groundbreaking case in the Civil Rights Movement was Brown versus Board of Education. Okay, this overturned the previous ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson, where separate but equal was the norm. Okay, no longer is separate but equal legal in America. So we had the whole desegregation thing happening. Okay, and there were actually people that opposed this, and they formed a little union, and it was called the Southern Manifesto. So we actually had schools fighting against this, and they were, of course, in the South. All right, around this time, we also had the War on Poverty started in America, and we see the beginnings of the Head Start program, which it's a program for little kids and toddlers to go ahead and pretty much get a head start for school, so they get a little bit of education and also childcare during the day so their parents can work. Alright, and we also have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Okay, with this, we realized, hey, we still need to make our schools better, and we started separating things from elementary and secondary and establishing more standards and being more clear about what types of grades taught what, and what was kind of the standard across America for an elementary school and a secondary school. Okay, and around this time, sciences and history still in the forefront of education. And another big thing addressed around this time was students with special needs. Okay, during World War II and before that time, people had neglected students and other citizens with special needs. So along with the civil rights movement, this was something that went along with that. Okay, inclusion was introduced around this time, including the students with special needs in the normal ed classes. 1970s, okay, career education. This was a big movement in the United States around this time. We wanted to make all education relevant to the workplace. This was a big goal of the federal government. This was their agenda. We wanted to create quality workers that could contribute to American society. Alright, so we still, around this time, this is right after the Civil Rights Movement in the 1970s, we're still having struggles with desegregation. This affects students. Okay, and then Public Law 94-142, Education of All Handicapped Children Act. Okay, this happened in the mid-70s, 1975, and this saw reforms in special education and saw the introduction of the IEP. And anybody who's ever dealt with special education knows what an IEP is. Even if you haven't dealt with special education, you probably know what it is. It's an individualized education plan, and what that is whether it's a child that is disabled or gifted or anything that's out of the ordinary, whether it's negative or positive, it's an individualized program for that specific student, and as a teacher you have to follow the instructions that are in there for that student. So this was a big deal for special education. It means that students were getting the things that they needed, or at least they were supposed to. Alright, and then with that we have the Title IX, and Title IX saw women's rights in the workplace and in the education place improved. Okay, there could be no discrimination against women, and that was in the workplace and education. Around this time, we're seeing a drop in national ACT and SAT scores, and education starts to receive criticism as a whole. People realize, hey, our education isn't where it needs to be. Okay, we made it to the moon in the 60s, we beat Russia. Now what was kind of the thing? People were starting to wonder what was going on with education. So in the early 80s, all right, we had a manuscript published called A Nation at Risk. All right, and this addressed the need for educational reform in America. All right, we realized that there were a lot of things wrong with our education, and we started scrambling to fix it. Ronald Reagan was a big part of this. All right, emphasis on higher education increased. This is when people were like, gotta go to college, gotta go to college. That's why people my age went to college, because their parents grew up thinking people who go to college are the ones that are successful. My parents grew up in the 70s and 80s, and they encouraged me to go to college because of things like this. The educational reforms that began around this time are unorganized because Ronald Reagan wants to decentralize education and make it more the state's responsibility. So the states are trying to fix things, but they're not getting a lot of money from the federal government, and it's all just kind of a big mess. It's not working out. People are trying, but it's not working out. So we see the development of a lot of different private schools and charter schools, religious schools. People are kind of losing faith in the public school system. And also around this time, there's an increase in homeschooling because, once again, people are unhappy with the public school system. All right. In the late 80s, we have an increase in interest in math, sciences, and reading. Okay, one of the big things was the Challenger incident where a teacher was supposed to go up in space, and everybody knows what happened when the Challenger space shuttle launched. It exploded, and there was a big interest in the sciences around that time because we were sending shuttles back into space around that time. Hadn't done it for a little while, so it was a big deal. Alright, so the 90s, that's when we started to make bigger strides in education reform. So we had outcome-based education, and this was student-centered learning methods that focus on empirically measuring student performance. So what that means is we're going to teach the kids, and then we're going to test them, and then we're going to see what they've learned. We're going to make these tests to see if what we're teaching them actually works. Okay, and we also see at the very end of the 1990s, we see standards-based national education goals, and a lot of these weren't met by 2000. And so we're still making some strides to reform, but we're not where we need to be. So in the 2000s, we see No Child Left Behind, NCLB. Everybody knows about No Child Left Behind. And this is a program that was put into action by George W. Bush's administration. And what this program attempted to do was leave no child behind. They wanted to catch up the students that were performing at the bottom. And this was to create a better workforce on average for America. Okay, constructivist teaching methods were widespread during this time. They wanted people to encourage their students to ask their own questions. Okay, it was an inquiry type of learning that they wanted to spread. All right. AYP, Annual Yearly Progress, was introduced around this time. A lot of teachers hate this. Okay, why? All right, in a year, there's a certain amount of progress that a student is expected to make. If a student doesn't make this progress, then he hasn't made his full annual yearly progress. If this happens too many times as a school, as a whole, then your federal funding gets cut and you have to rebuild your school from the ground up. Okay? And this happened to some schools. Alright? So there was a big focus on testing, and scores did improve nationally overall, but it wasn't by a huge amount. They did improve, and it was a little better than marginal, but it wasn't a huge amount. Alright? And there were big criticisms about this. Too much emphasis on testing, and teachers claimed that there were impossible goals to meet, things like 100% graduation rate, things like that. And one of the other big things that special education complained about was the needs of advanced children were not being met. Because of No Child Left Behind, we were focused on the children that were being left behind, not the students who were ahead. And some people thought that this was hurting America because we were slowing down our best and brightest children. So now, in the wake of No Child Left Behind, we have the Common Core program. Common Core program is an education initiative in the United States that details what K-12 students nationwide should know in English, language arts, and mathematics at the end of each grade. So it sets pretty much a nationwide standard for all the students in America. And the goals are either that graduates are ready for college or ready to enter the workforce. And these Common Core standards, they've met a lot of mixed reviews. A lot of teachers don't like them because they still have an emphasis on testing. There's still a huge emphasis on testing. And some of the standards in the Common Core curriculum are things that aren't clear how to be taught. The teachers have no background or education on how to teach certain things. Like, how does a teacher teach ingenuity? Okay, those are some of the things that are expected to be taught in Common Core. All right, that's a big deal. You know, if a teacher doesn't know for sure how to teach something, how are they supposed to teach it to their students? And then how are they supposed to be evaluated? And also, politicians had a big hand in making these. There wasn't a lot of educators that were involved in making these Common Core standards, and so there have been a lot of complaints by teachers and education administration about these Common Core standards. However, a lot of people do think it's a good idea because it sets a national standard for all students. And I think that is a good idea because students across America do need to be responsible for certain amounts of knowledge, but they need to be measurable, and the teachers need to have freedom to be able to meet these standards and goals however they need to in their certain situation, because every school and every child is different, and you can't say this way will work best for every type of school or every type of student. So we've come from colonial America to America now, and so that's about it. So this was the history and political goals of education, and it's come from patriotism and ethics to now we're concerned with intelligence and creating a better workforce for America to outperform other nations.